Chinese food in America did not change because Americans understood it better. It changed because Chinese people were not allowed to belong. What Americans eat today as Chinese food is not just the result of taste preferences or culinary creativity. It is the result of laws, violence, exclusion, and survival under racism. The menu itself became a shield, a way to stay invisible while still making a living. To understand how racism shaped Chinese food in America, you have to understand that food was never just food. It was one of the only legal, economic spaces Chinese immigrants were allowed to occupy. When Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States in the mid-1800s, they were not welcomed as workers or neighbors. They were treated as temporary, disposable labor. They were expected to build railroads, mine gold, and clean cities, and then disappear. Instead, they stayed. This terrified white Americans. Anti-Chinese sentiment spread quickly. Newspapers described Chinese immigrants as dirty, immoral, unassimilable. Politicians blamed them for unemployment. Violence followed. Chinatowns were attacked. Businesses were destroyed. People were murdered. Food became part of that hatred. Chinese cooking was mocked as strange and dangerous. Ingredients were portrayed as disgusting. Eating Chinese food was framed as risky, even immoral. These ideas were not accidental. They were designed to mark Chinese people as outsiders. At the same time, Chinese immigrants were locked out of most professions. They could not own land. They could not work in many industries. They could not testify against white people in court. They could not become citizens. Restaurants were one of the few businesses they were allowed to run. This meant Chinese food had to do something impossible. It had to attract white customers while Chinese people themselves were rejected. So the food changed. Dishes became less visibly Chinese. Strong smells were reduced. Ingredients were familiarized. Meat was cut into recognizable shapes. Vegetables were softened. Sauces were thickened and sweetened. Menus were written in English. Names were simplified. Regional identity disappeared. Instead of Cantonese food or Toisan food, everything became just Chinese. This was not accidental. It was survival. White Americans feared what they did not understand. Chinese cooks learned to remove that fear from the plate. Chop suey was the perfect example. It was flexible. It was inexpensive. It used ingredients Americans already knew. And most importantly, it did not demand cultural understanding. It could be eaten without learning anything about China. Chop suey allowed Americans to feel adventurous without feeling challenged. That is why it succeeded. During the height of anti-Chinese violence, chop suey houses spread across the United States. Americans flocked to them even as they supported laws banning Chinese immigration. This contradiction was not uncomfortable for them. Food was entertainment. People were politics. Chinese restaurants learned a painful lesson. The food could be accepted even if the people were not. As exclusion laws hardened, Chinese communities became trapped. Immigration stopped. Families were separated. Many restaurants became family-run because they had no choice. Children grew up inside kitchens. The menu became conservative. Risk was dangerous. Restaurants that experimented too much failed. The safest path was to give Americans exactly what they already liked. This is how standardization happened. By the early 1900s, Chinese restaurants across America served nearly identical menus. Chop suey, fried rice, chow mein, egg foo young, dishes that did not exist in China, but existed everywhere in America. Racism froze the menu in place. While food in China continued to evolve, American Chinese food could not. Any change risked rejection. Safety meant familiarity. Then came the Chinese Exclusion Act. It did more than stop immigration. It froze culture. With no new immigrants arriving, American Chinese food became disconnected from China entirely. Recipes were passed down without reference to their origins. Ingredients became fully American. Taste preferences locked in. World War II temporarily softened attitudes toward China, but not toward Chinese Americans. They were still treated as foreigners. still stereotyped, still excluded. But something changed after the war. America suburbanized. Convenience became central to life. Families wanted fast, affordable meals. Chinese restaurants adapted again. Food became portable. Takeout culture exploded. The folded paper box became iconic. It wasn't Chinese. It was American engineering. Fortune cookies became expected. They weren't Chinese. They were American inventions inspired by Japanese snacks. But Americans demanded them, so Chinese restaurants provided them. This was not deception. It was compliance. Cream cheese entered the menu. Deep frying increased. Sweet sauces dominated. These changes were not made to mock tradition. They were made because Americans rewarded them. Every purchase reinforced the direction of the cuisine. By the 1950s and 1960s, American Chinese food was fully separated from China. It was its own cuisine, shaped not by homeland memory, but by American pressure. And racism never disappeared. Chinese restaurants were still seen as cheap, disposable, late-night food. They were rarely treated as fine dining. Their owners were rarely treated as chefs. Even as Americans loved the food, they did not respect the culture. This contradiction shaped everything. Menus avoided regional specificity because Americans didn't care. Dishes were named for generals Americans had never heard of. Sauce recipes were adjusted endlessly to please customer expectations. When immigration reopened in the late 20th century, new Chinese immigrants arrived with different food traditions. But by then, American Chinese food was already established. Customers didn't want change. They wanted nostalgia. Ironically, authenticity became a marketing tool only after racism loosened its grip. When Americans began seeking real Chinese food, it was often separate from the Chinese food they already loved. Two cuisines existed side by side, one born of survival, one born of rediscovery. American Chinese food was never trying to be Chinese food from China. It was trying to exist in America, and it succeeded. Today, arguments about whether American Chinese food is real miss the truth. Real food reflects real conditions, and the conditions Chinese immigrants faced were brutal. Every sweet sauce tells the story of appeasement. Every fried dish tells the story of adaptation. Every simplified menu tells the story of fear. American Chinese food is not inauthentic. It is historical evidence. It proves that culture does not travel untouched. It proves that racism shapes what people are allowed to keep and what they must abandon. And yet, despite all of this, Chinese immigrants built something enduring. They fed America. They introduced millions to flavors they had never known. They normalized eating across cultures. They quietly reshaped American taste. They did it while being excluded, mocked, and restricted. That is the real story behind American Chinese food. Not invention, not imitation, survival.